Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Basra Samach Beis, but we're going to start on Samach Aleph on the Beis, 61b, 8 lines from the bottom. And the daf yomi is dedicated for Yeshua, for the Chayalim, Hatzalah for the Shvuyim, Mishmir for Am Yisrael in this Eis Tzara. The Gemara tells us, Ahuda Amoy L'Chavre, there was a person who said to his friend, Ara de Bechia Mizamnanocha. I'm going to sell you Mizamnanocha. I'm going to sell you the field that's called the Bechia. But the problem was, Havoi Tarta Rasa Dali Miskar in the Bechia. There are actually two fields that were called the Bechia. So what should he do? So Amar Ravashi, what did he sell? So Ravashi said, Chada Amarway Tarti Lo. Amarway. He intended to sell him one field, but not two. So therefore, he only had sold him the smaller of the fields. But Arata Stama, but if he sold him the lands of Rabbi Chia, not the Ara de Bechia, but the lands, Arasa, then Miut Arasa Shtaim. Then the assumption is that he sold him two, which is the minimum of the plural. The Amrway Ko Arasa, and if he said to him, hold on. And if he said to him, Ko Arasa, the Islay, if he said all my land, and he means to sell him all of his lands, Labarmi Bustani Upardisi, except for the gardens and the orchards. Zihara, if he said to him, the Zihara, which means whatever I basically have in my possession, my whole Nachala, my whole inheritance, all of your lands together is called like a Zihara, it's called your portfolio, I guess would be the proper word. Then the field be Bustani Upardisi. Then he intended even to sell the gardens and the orchards of Armi Bati Vavdi, but he didn't intend to sell the houses and the servants. The Amrway, we're on top of 62a. The Amrway Nilse, if he said, I want to sell all my assets, then I feel Bati Vavdi. Then he intended to sell even the houses and the slaves. Oh, Boker Tov, Eric. We're on the top of 62a. 62a. So we're on the top line. Gemara says now, and now we have drawings here. So I'm assuming everybody has similar drawings, whatever Gemara you're using. Meitzer or Meitzer Echad Aruch or Meitzer Echad Katzar. Let's say the seller was selling to the buyer, and he marked out one boundary, one border of the field he was selling, and he made it short, and the other border he made it long. So did he intend to sell the shorter version or the longer version? So we're on top of 62a. So said Rav, you see the version on the side of the Gemara in the commentary of Rashbam. You see what I'm talking about. The part that says Ketzar is the shorter and the Aruch is the longer. And they draw like a little softer line going from the shorter to the longer. So Rav says he really only intended to sell the shorter version. Amalei Rav Kahana and Rav Asi. So Rav has these students who were very dedicated to him, and they were Rav Kahana and Rav Asi. And they said, V'yikne keneged. They said to their Rebbe Rav, we're 62a. So they said to their Rebbe Rav, V'yikne keneged Rosh Tor. Why don't we assume that he sold on a diagonal? Rosh Tor is a diagonal. Either it's like a head of an ox or it's like a piece of jewelry, but it's a diagonal. Rashbam says like the heads of the oxes. So why don't we assume there's a diagram there? Why don't we assume that he sold it on a diagonal? And the Gemara says, no, we're not going to say that. So why don't we say that? Indeed, we should say that. Shasik Rav. Rav was quiet. So Rav was challenged by his students, and his response, Rashbam says, was to admit that they were correct. So we learn from here a very important point, that the teacher should admit when his students have a good point. So Moda Rav, and before Rav was even admitted to this, he admitted to something else. Heichot the Ikar Meitzer Ruven Shimon Michad Gisa, Meitzer Levi Vihuda Michad Gisa. Rav himself admitted in a circumstance where Reuben and Shimon were on one side, and Levi and Yehuda were on the other side. If you look at the Rashbam on the right side of your daf, it's the third diagram down that Reuben and Shimon are on the top, and Levi and Yehuda are on the bottom. There, would Rav would for sure admit that it's a diagonal from Reuben to Yehuda and cutting out Levi, because why else? The Reuben connected Levi, the Shimon connected Yehuda. Well, because of it, because he could have just written, I'm selling you Reuben to Levi, but from the fact he says Reuben and Shimon to Yehuda, that means that he clearly intends to encompass it on a diagonal. Shema Mina, Keneged Rosh Tor Huda. We see from here, he intends to do it on a diagonal. So now, the next piece, is it, Eric, are you hot? Should I put on the air conditioning? I could just put it on, take me a second. Sure. Okay, so we're up to the next piece. Gemara says, what's the next piece here is Meitzer Ruvein Mizrach Umarav, Meitzer Shimon Tzafon V'Daram. So now you can, if you're looking at the Rashbam, you see the fourth diagram down on the right side. Ruvein is written on the east and the west, and Shimon is written on the south and the north. The interesting thing that everybody should remember is that the medieval maps, they put the east on the top and the west on the bottom. Not like us, we put the north on the top. They face Jerusalem, so therefore they always put the east on the top. And Jerusalem in the medieval world was always in the center of the world. So Meitzer Ruvein Mizrach Umarav and Meitzer Shimon Tzafon V'Daram. So Reuben's borders are the east and the west. So he's bordered on the east and the west by Reuben's field. And by Shimon's field, he's bordered on the north and the south. So the seller needs to write, Meitzer Reuben Ruchen Train, who Meitzer Shimon Ruchen Train. He has to write, I'm selling you Reuben's field from two directions and Shimon's from two directions. Because otherwise, you could just make a diagonal, as you see in this diagram, cutting off and basically selling only the parts that Reuben and Shimon, the minimum amount where you could be selling their field, which is the diagonal part and not the full square. Okay. Ibailu, so the Gemara now asks them the following question. The Gemara is going to ask three questions, and we're not going to have an answer to any of them. Siyam loa sakranos mahu. So let's say siyam means a sign. Let's see, Rashbam says he has a lot of fields surrounding him from a lot of people. And he didn't write, and the only thing he wrote were the four corners of the field, but he didn't write the length and the width at all. Do we say that you don't typically just sell corners of a field, you really sell the whole field, and that's what he was intending to do by marking the field? Or perhaps we say that he tried to make like a line from the corners, like an X. You see here the fifth diagram down on the right side of the page by the Rashbam. Maybe that's what he was intending to sell. Alternatively, the next question is, Ma'u kamin gam mahu. Let's say, even if you say that he didn't intend to sell the corners there, he intended to sell the whole field, let's say he marked it like a gam. This is the Greek letter gamma. Rashi says it's like a chaf sofit, like a final chaf. So basically, there do we say that he intended to sell just the space in between the two corners with the gamma mark? Or maybe there he intended to sell the whole field, and that's why he marked all four sides. And then bisirugin mahu. So here again, we have to look at the picture of the Rashbam on the top of 62b. basically here we're talking about is that Rashbam says there are 8 people who had fields around him, and 2 in every direction. Reuven and Shimon on the east, and Levi Yehuda on the north, Yisachar Zevulun in the Yisachar and Zevulun in the next direction, etc. And Yosef Binyamin on the south. So the question is, what is he intended to sell? Reuben said, I'm selling you the border of, on the eastern border, I'm selling you Levi. He said as follows. He said, Reuben is my eastern border. Levi is my northern border. Yisachar is my western border. And Yosef is my southern border. Basically, he skipped every other one. So do you want to say, Rashbam says, that in a case of a gamma, in the Greek letter gamma, he only acquires it on a diagonal? That's because that's what people typically sell. They sell one furrow amongst the 2 fields, but you don't typically sell a field where you skip every other field. So, or do we say no, he intended to sell the whole? Or do we say no, he intended to sell just the borders on a diagonal, like cutting it up like a pizza pie, as you can see from the diagram on the left side of the page, the first diagram of the Rashbam. So the Gemara now says, take it. The Gemara says we leave all these questions unresolved, in which case we say that the baseline is like the seller and the purchaser has to bring proof to get it, so therefore we remain with the seller. Meitzer lo meitzer rishon, umeitzer sheni, umeitzer shlishi. So now we have another case. He marked his border. He marked the border 1, 2, and 3. Umeitzer reviu umeitzer, but he didn't mark out the 4th border. He never marked it out exactly. So what has he sold? Amar Rav. So Rav says, "Kana kol chutz meitzer revi." In those days, the border was like an elevated piece of ground. So Rav says he's acquired everything there except for this one marker, the border marker for the 4th side. That's what he has left out. Shmuel Amar afilu meitzer revi. Shmuel says no, he's also acquired this border marker. And the reason why he didn't mark it is because he didn't see a need to mark it. So Rav Asi Amar Lokana Ela Telam Echad Al Pnei Kula. Rav Asi says, no, actually, he only acquired one furrow that's basically the border marker of the 3 borders, meaning to say, like a chet. Like basically, he's acquired just a chet, one row around those 3 borders, the minimum amount that he could have acquired, like a chet around the 3 sides. Why? Several Karav. So Rav Asi holds like his Rebbe Rav, the Amar Shiri Shire, that when he was doing this, he was intending to leave something for himself. And just like he intended to leave out this border, it's clear that his intent was to leave out something in the whole field. And so therefore, Rav Asi is saying he sold the minimum. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava Hilchasa Kana Kol Chutz Meitzer Revi. So Rava says the law is he's acquired everything except for one furrow on the 4th side, meaning to say the border of the 4th side. Lo Amran Elad Lo Mivla. And when do we say this, that this is the case, that he's acquired everything except for the border on the 4th side? Only where the border on the 4th side is not included within the boundary markers of the other 3 sides. If you look at the diagram of Rashbam, on the second diagram on his page, the bottom diagram, there's 2 pictures, one on the right and one on the left. The one that we're referring to as low muvla was not absorbed. It's external to the boundary. So then, that's when we say he's acquired everything except for the fourth border. But mivla, but if the fourth border was actually absorbed within the other three borders, then kana, then he has acquired it. V'chilo mivla, and when it's not absorbed, nami lo amran, we also say he hasn't, that he, when do we say, when it's not absorbed, when do we say he has not acquired it? Lo amran, chilo mivla, nami lo amran, el de ikoe rilkva de dikla, vave tishas kabin. When do we say if it's not absorbed that he has not acquired it? When there's a lot of trees there, or there's enough area where he can produce a significant amount of food that's called 9 kabin of, let's say, wheat. When if it didn't have these trees or this amount of area to produce this grain, then we're going to say kana. Then we're going to say that he's acquired it, because the assumption is he wouldn't sell it separately because it's too small. So this proves this proves that if it's absorbed, then even if there are richva the dikla of avatishas kabin, even if there are richva the dikla, even if there are trees and 9 kabin, if it's absorbed, then we're going to say he's acquired it because it was absorbed on the 3 boundaries. So according to this version of Rava, let me just summarize because we're going to give a different version now. If it's absorbed, he's acquired it. Let me just say what Rava is saying here. So Rava is saying, when do we say? Rava says that if you only mark the 3 boundaries, you've acquired also the 4th boundary. But we only say that when it was not absorbed. But if it was absorbed, then you've acquired it. I mean to say, Rava says if it was not absorbed, the 4th boundary was not absorbed, then you've not acquired it. But if it was absorbed, you've acquired it. And Rava says that's when do we say you've acquired it if it was not absorbed? Where there are palm trees. When do we say if it was not absorbed, you did not acquire it? Where there are a significant amount of palm trees and land. Because clearly he didn't intend to sell because it's its own thing. But if there were no palm trees and land, then you acquired it with the other 3 boundaries. But this means that if it was absorbed in the land, then even if there are palm trees and a significant land, you still acquired it. But now there's a different version of Rava. There's a different version of Rava that Rava taught. Rava says that if you sold it and you didn't mark out the 4th boundary, the purchaser has acquired everything, even the 4th border. He acquired everything. Below Amran Ela de Mivla. That's only when it's absorbed. Avalo Mivla, but if it's not absorbed, lo Kani. If it's not absorbed, he has not acquired it. And even if it's absorbed, we don't say that he acquired it. Where there's no palm trees or land. But if it's its own significant field, it's got palm trees and a significant amount of land, lo kana. Then he has not acquired it. We see from here that when it's not absorbed, we see from here that when it's not absorbed, even though there are not palm trees and a significant amount of land, lo kani. He's not acquired it. Shamina mitravayo. In this part, the commentaries say was added in by the Gaonim because this is a summary which you don't typically see in the Gemara. Shamina mitravayo. We see from both of these languages of Rava. Shamina mitravayo was from the Rava. The besada lo shayar v'amidi. That from the field where you marked the 3 boundaries, he didn't leave anything out. Meaning to say, He didn't sell just the chet around the field, but he sold the whole 3 fields. So that's very clear. And the only debate is about the fourth boundary. And also, according to both versions of Rava, in a circumstance where it was absorbed and it wasn't significant, this fourth border basically didn't have the palm trees and the Tisha Kabin, then clearly it was included in the sale. Lo mivla, but where is there a dispute between Rava? And in case where it was not absorbed, the Ika Rivkfa de Dikla, and it was not absorbed, but there were palm trees, meaning to say, in a case where it was not absorbed, and there are palm trees and the 9 kavin, lo kana, then everybody would say, in a circumstance where it was not absorbed, and there are these palm trees and the teshakabin, then everybody would say the person has not acquired it because it was not absorbed in it. It's a significant piece of land. Where is there a dispute? Mivla v'ikale and lo mivla v'leikale, itmar lo ahai gisa v'itmar lo ahai gisa and shuda the daina. So in a case where it was absorbed, but it's still a significant amount of land, it has the palm trees, or if it was not absorbed, but it's not a significant amount of land, it doesn't have the palm trees, then we have the dispute between the two versions, and in the end we say Shuddha the Daina. Shuddha the Daina is, it's up to the individual judge to decide. How much discretion the judge actually has is a dispute amongst the Rishonim, whether he has to see what he thinks the case would rule, or whether he really has total discretion. We give it to whoever he wants, but in that case, since there's two versions of Rava, he can rule however he wants. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava, Palga de Islay Ba'ara. If a person uses an expression, I'm selling to you the half that I have in this land, Palga. That means he's selling half to him. But let's say he says Palga Ba'ara de Islay. But let's say he says, I'm selling to you half from my portion of the land, meaning to say the assumption is here that he's a partner in the land, and he basically owns half, and he's selling half from his portion. That means riva. That means he's intending to sell a quarter. So Abai says, no, you're making too much of an assumption. It's really the same. He should really be selling half in both cases, not in the second case a quarter. So ishtik, indeed, Rabba was quiet when his student Abai challenged him. Amar Abai says, Ana Savri, mi de ishtik kibui kabla. I thought from the fact that my Rebbe Rabba was quiet, he accepted my ruling, my question, my challenge. Lohi. But it's actually not the case. Chazina hanu shtari denafki mi beimar. I saw that there were these contracts that went out from Rabba's Bezdin because of Behu Hachi. And he wrote on them, Palga de Isli Ba'ara, Palga Ba'ara de Isli Riva. And he said, like he said, he didn't change it. That even if he uses an expression, half in the land that is mine, he intends to give a quarter. The Amarabba, Meitzer Ara, Demina Palga. And Rabba says, somebody sold to his friend the western portion of the field, and he left back for himself the eastern portion, and he didn't explain how much he sold and how much he left for himself. And in the sale, he wrote the boundaries. So we have to see how he marked it. If he wrote the western border of the field is the field of Levi, and Meitzer Ara Demine Palga, and the eastern portion of the field from which I have, that means Palga. That means he intends to sell half the field, because since he says that the field was divided, implies it was divided in half. But let's say he says Meitzer Ara Demina Psika Tishakanim. But let's say he uses the language the border of the land from it has a psika, meaning has a portion of significant land, and that means he intends to give just an amount, which is the minimum amount of significant field. Abai says, I don't see the difference. So Ishtik Rabba was quiet. Savar Minei. So there were students who were there who thought Idi Idi Palga, that in both cases he intended to give half. Lohi, but it's not the case. We're on top of 63a. Number of Yemar Parshalme with Idim Farshli Mini Dabaye, that he says, I heard myself these halachos from Abaye, and he says, and he had ruled Bain Meitzer Ara Demina Palgo, Bain Meitzer Ara Demina Piska, Yamalei Elin Metzarana Palga, Lamalei Elin Metzarana Tisha Kavan. If he used the expression, these are your boundaries, then he's actually saying he's giving half. But if he doesn't specify it by saying that, then he really means to give the 9 kavan. Okay, so this is today's daf, and we'll stop here, and God willing, pick this up again at 8 o'clock this morning. If anybody has any questions, happy to address.